Welcome everyone. In this video, we are going to focus on integration testing, which is, I think, one of the most important layers of testing in modern software development. So while unit tests focus on individual components, integration tests check how those components interact with each other. The goal here is to catch issues in the connections, right? Those glue pieces between services, APIs, database, and other modules. So integration tests help us ensure that different parts of the system really play nicely together and that data flows correctly between them. So there are several great tools available for integration testing, really depending on your project and language. And I hope you understand at this point, this is kind of a theme in testing and in DevOps. We have a lot of tools. It looks super overwhelming from the outside because you think you have to learn all of these things, but it really does come down to your project, your language, your objectives. There's a lot of things that go into it. So just a couple of the high-level ones here. Supertest, which is widely used for testing APIs in Node.js applications. Postman, which is great for manual and automated API testing, really for multiple languages. Newman, which allows you to run Postman collections from the command line or in our continuous integration pipelines. And things like Rest Assured, which is a really great tool for API testing, specifically in Java projects. So choosing the right tool can make your integration tests faster to write and easier to maintain, but it really does come down to what you're using and what you're trying to achieve. So, what is an integration test? I can hear you asking me that already, right? An integration test checks how multiple components of systems interact with each other. So instead of testing a single function in isolation, like we did with unit tests, right? You're verifying that multiple parts, like an API controller, a service layer, a database, they work together. They work correctly. So this is kind of closer to how our users experience your application, not like in isolated pieces, but in a full workflow. So why does it matter? Right? And maybe that's a silly question because you're like, well, I want to make sure all of the pieces of my application work together correctly, so that seems like a no-brainer. Well, I mean, yes, but integration tests matter because they verify the collaboration between components, but then we can also simulate real-world test cases, real-world use cases, like saving a user to a database and then retrieving information. We can catch bugs between the layers. So that's really something a unit test can't detect. A unit test can help us see, are we actually returning the data correctly in this module or returning the data correctly from this function? But moving data, like saving a user to a database, can't really tell me, is the problem on the API side? Is it on the client side? What's going on there? That's what an integration test is for. So there's a key part here in that DevOps pipeline. Integration tests really help ensure that system integrity before deployments, so we can't accidentally uncouple some of our components. Without integration tests, systems are going to behave unpredictably under real conditions. So let's look at just an example of some C# code here. We start with an in-memory version of an ASP.NET app called Web Application Factory, and we are using an HTTP client to send a request to the endpoint API products. And then we can assert that if we receive an HTTP 200 OK status, that the response contains the expected product data. So this kind of test just helps us ensure that the API endpoint, the controller, the routing, and the data retrieval, this whole thing works. It all works together and I get the expected result. So when is an integration test kind of appropriate? What's the typical scenario? So here's a couple of common ones. This isn't going to be, comprehensive by any means, but this should help maybe spark some ideas about, when should I use an integration test? So anytime we have this API and database interaction, creating a user, retrieving a user, that kind of thing, we can test, just like in that C# example, we can kind of think of that as its own little pipeline. That whole pipeline, that whole chain reaction of interactions between components, is that happening the way it needs to? Am I getting the right data back? Service to service communication. So if your application is using microservices to exchange data, then you can check that that is actually happening properly and the data is going where it needs to go. If it's being processed and returned, you can check the response. Things like middleware and routing. So ensuring that requests flow correctly through those different layers and that you don't have an endpoint issue or a routing issue. And then file system or message queues. Verifying that files are saved or that messages are sent and received properly. So whenever there are multiple parts of the system that need to connect, that's a perfect spot for integration tests. So some tips, some best practices, how to keep our integration tests effective. We want to test our databases and use test databases like SQLite or in-memory databases for isolation and speed. You can seed known consistent data so that your tests are repeatable, because we want to be able to isolate an issue if we are constantly changing the data or constantly using production data. The tests might actually produce kind of like a false positive under certain conditions where if you are using consistent data, you're able to test more effectively. Run your integration tests inside your CI pipeline. This is going to block bad or broken code from actually reaching production. So unlike unit tests, where a lot of times the developer is creating those and running those in their own local environment, before they even push that code, they can run their unit tests. Integration tests should be integrated into the pipeline so that as those modules or as those connective pieces are checked in, those can run, and if there's a problem, it won't be integrated into the build. Keep your tests fast and modular. Don't load the entire system unnecessarily. Make sure you're breaking things down into pieces and that you're not trying to test way too much, because generally when we test too much, it starts to become difficult to troubleshoot where an error or a failed test is actually coming from. And then the last one is simply just some housekeeping. Typically, we store our integration tests separately in a dedicated integration folder of the project. That's not necessarily a requirement. It just makes finding your tests easier. So following some of these best practices can make your tests faster. We can make sure they're more reliable and they're easier to manage. So integration versus unit versus end-to-end, because we've talked about unit tests and we're going to talk about further testing, but let's just compare real quick to make sure we understand where things are. So unit tests are fast, they're easy to write, and they focus on testing those single functions or methods. Integration tests are a little slower, and they test how those multiple components interact. End-to-end tests simulate the entire system as the user would experience it. They're slowest and they're the most fragile because there's a lot of places for them to go wrong and a test to fail. And as we talk about all of the different tests that are available and that are part of our DevOps journey as we build out a successful pipeline, we need to understand that each test type has a role. Integration tests bridge the gap between unit tests and as we move towards a full system end-to-end test. So summary, right? Integration testing helps us ensure that all parts of the system work together smoothly. They bridge the gap between the small unit tests and big full system tests. And done right, integration tests can reduce bugs, build confidence, and ensure your application behaves as expected when everything connects. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about integration tests. There are a lot of different types of testing out there. We're going to talk about all of the ones we need for our DevOps pipeline that we're going to build, and really make sure we understand the differences as well as where they fit in the testing scheme of things. So I will see you in the next video. Thanks so much.